Well, I want to start our time off this morning just thinking about what are some of those moments in life that have left you feeling powerless or helpless? Or what are those times in your life where you have just felt stuck? If you've ever been without a job for any extended period of time, if you've ever been unemployed, I'm sure you don't feel like you have a good sense of control over your situation. You might be someone who's just submitting application one after the other after the other. Your life is just you looking at job boards all day. But you know in that season that the power to hire you, it doesn't really lie with you. It remains outside of you. Or maybe you do already have a job. But the question that you're asking is really, am I going to have a job tomorrow? Maybe there have been layoffs at work. Maybe there's just some strange pressure and tension going on in the workplace. And though you're trying to pull your weight, you're trying to prove your worth, you know that the power to make that decision of whether or not you're hired, or in this case fired, that doesn't really lie with you. That might be someone else's decision who you don't even know those people, and they don't even know you. Or maybe where you feel helpless, it isn't even necessarily connected to anything particular in your circumstances. Maybe you just feel anxious all the time. Or maybe you just feel worried and fearful all the time. Maybe you just feel frustrated all the time, and you feel powerless to feel any other way. You're stuck in your emotions. Or maybe it's in your fight against sin. Maybe you want to be better. You genuinely desire to do all the things that God has commanded you to do, but unfortunately the only thing that you see yourself doing time and time again is all the things that you know that you shouldn't be doing. And you feel helpless to change. Well, if you have ever felt that way, if you have ever felt powerless, if you have ever felt helpless, if you have ever felt stuck, then you have felt the way that Abram no doubt feels here in our passage. So Abram is who we refer to now as Abraham, but here in our passage he hasn't yet gotten that name. So Abram, he was called by God 3 chapters earlier, in chapter 12, to leave his own country, to leave his father's house, and to go to a land that God would show him. And God, when he meets with Abram for the first time, he says, I'm going to rain down blessings upon you. When these two first meet, God says this. He says, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. That's a wonderful blessing. That's the first time Abram and God meet, and those are God's words that he says to him. And at hearing them, Abram obeys. He leaves it all behind, and he becomes a sojourner, and he becomes a wanderer in the world, waiting for God to do what he said he was going to do. He's waiting, and he's wandering, and he's waiting, and he's wandering, and he's waiting, and waiting, and waiting, and years go by. Abram was 75 years old when him and God first met. And as he's waiting, he's not getting any younger. He's 10 years older than his wife Sarai. She's not getting any younger. And the question Abram is no doubt starting to wonder here is, am I a fool? Am I a fool? Is God really going to deliver? Is God really going to keep those promises that he made? Here in this passage, God comes to Abram, here now in Genesis 15, actually 13 years later. from that first meeting. And God comes to Abram to answer those questions and to help Abram in his waiting and in his wandering. And he does this in a very interesting way. God comes to Abram, and what he does for Abram is he reorients Abram's sight. He makes Abram look at something else. Here in our passage, God redirects Abram's eyes to actually look at two different things. And these are the two things that we're going to look at this morning, because these are the two things that God directs us to. Time and time again, it's the same old thing that God tells us to look at and to keep our eyes fixed on. When life looks hopeless, when you feel powerless, when you feel stuck, you and I, we are called to look at the promises of God, and you and I are called to look at the God of promise. Those are going to be our 2 points for this morning. This is how we're going to walk through this passage, by looking at the promises of God, and then by looking at the God of the promise. So first, let's look at the promises of God. So we know from the rest of this chapter, as we've already said, that Abram is clearly troubled. He's worried about his future and the future of his household. If you have ever been woken up in the middle of the night and you've got this weight on your chest because you're not exactly worried what tomorrow is going to look like for you or for your family, this is one of those nights for Abram. Well, look at verse 1. God comes to Abram in a vision that night to comfort him. And he gives him this greeting. He says, "Fear not, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great." Now, I want us to think about what that greeting is really saying. God tells Abram, he commands him really. He says, "Don't be afraid, Abram." And then he gives him 2 reasons why. The first reason is I am your shield. What this means is God is saying, you are safe, Abram. I am the one who protects you. I'm the one who watches over you. Fear not, don't be afraid. I'm with you, and I'm going to keep you from harm. But then also, he says, you not only don't have to worry about troubles on the outside, but you also don't need to worry about troubles within, and particularly troubles that come from lacking, because he says, your reward is going to be very great. I'm not just going to provide for you, but I'm going to bless you and reward you in abundance. Your prize is going to be full, and it's going to be grand. It's a beautiful greeting. I'm sure all of us would just love it for God to come to us and to say those words, "Fear not, I am your shield. Your reward will be very great." But listen to how Abram responds. Abram says, "But, O Lord, what will you give me? For I continue childless." Like we've said, he feels a way. We've all felt at some point or another, but he also feels it in a very unique way, because there's a particular uniqueness to infertility. There's very few things in life that will leave you feeling as powerless and as helpless as trying for a child and just being stuck to no avail. You feel this utter grief because you keep trying and you keep trying and you keep trying, but you feel like within you all that there is just the problem, but certainly not the solution. And so Abram asks God here, "O Lord, what will you give me? For I am going to my end childless. I'm old, God. I'm going to die soon. And I have no heir of my own. You can give me whatever it is that you want to give me. You can surely deliver all those blessings that you said, but none of that is really going to matter if I don't have a child? I want us to think about this for a moment. This isn't just a sentimental problem for Abram. And when I say that, I don't mean that children are just sentimental. But I want us to think about what Abram has done thus far. He has bet his whole life on God's promise. He's bet his whole life on the first word that the Lord has spoken to him. But now he's starting to doubt, and I think understandably so, because year after year, all he sees is his wife barren. All he sees is just, this wandering and this waiting and wondering, where in the world am I going? And all he sees is an empty house. He's no doubt discouraged and frustrated, and I think we can understand why he's being just a little bold here. And he's saying, "What will you give me? For I continue childless." But look at how God responds to Abram. It's not in the way I think many of us sort of think that God is going to respond to us when we have our own doubts about things. I think oftentimes we think, shame on me for doubting. And God is looking at you saying, shame on you for doubting. But that's not how God responds to Abram here. He doesn't respond to him with anger or shame. But look at verse 5. God takes Abram outside, and he just tells him to look up. Look up, Abram. He says, look towards heaven and number the stars if you're able to number them. And then he says, so shall your offspring be. God doesn't respond to Abram with shame, but he responds to him with comfort by leading him to a place and fixing his eyes up to heaven. As one of my fellow pastors has said, what strengthens Abram here in his faith is that God redirects his sight. He gets Abram's eyes off of his circumstances. He gets Abram's eyes off of this mess that he calls life, and he looks up at the stars. He tells Abram to look up at the heavens and to fix his eyes on God's wonderful promise. Number the stars, Abram, if you're able to number them. Count them. We'll be here all day or all night. Don't look at your barren wife. Don't look at your empty home. Don't look at this other person who you think is going to inherit all that you have. No, look at what I have made. Just as I made the cosmos, just as I made all of those wonderful lights that you see in the heavens, so too am I able to make from your old body a child. So am I able to make from your failing body, which is as good as dead, life. And in verse 6, after God changes Abram's line of sight and takes it off of himself, and he puts it back on his wonderful promise, we get this beautiful verse. Abram believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. So if there's any lesson here for us, church, during our own times of grief or of waiting or wandering or frustration, any sense of this feeling of powerless, if there's any lesson here, it's just simply this. Look at the promises of God. Keep your eyes fixed on the promises of God. You and I, we put our faith in what we see. We put our faith in what is in front of us. It's easy when you're in a long season of waiting to see all the troubles, to see all the mess, to see your own limitations and your own helplessness. It's easy to put your faith in those things And it's easy to get discouraged and to begin to doubt whether or not God's promises are true. But what God is directing you to do this morning is the same thing that He's directing Abram to do. Don't look at yourself. Don't look at your circumstances. Look at the promises of God. Fix your eyes there. So that's the first place that God tells Abram to direct his eyes, to keep his eyes fixed, to look at the promises of God, because they're more real than anything that's going on in your life right now. But the reason that he tells him to do that is because he is the one saying it. Because the promise is only as good as the one who is making it. And this brings us to our second point, which is that we're not just called to look at God's promises, but we're also called to look at the God of promise. As we've said, a promise is only as good as the person who's making it. I'm sure if given the opportunity, none of us would want to enter into some sort of financial transaction with Bernie Madoff. I'm sure if given the opportunity, none of us would want to invest with Sam Bankman-Fried. For those of you who are familiar with cryptocurrency, you know who that is. Or kids, would any of you take a promise from Mother Gothel? Or from the wolf in the Little Red Riding Hood? Would those be good, trusted people? No, before we enter into an agreement with someone, we always gauge the trustworthiness of that person. And even though Abram, in verse 6, he says that he has faith in God, that doesn't mean that he doesn't still have his questions. God finally reveals to Abram his land. He says, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it. But then in verse 8, Abram asks this. He says, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? And it's at this point in our story where we begin to see how seriously God takes His word and how seriously God takes His promises. God doesn't mess around. Right away, the very next line, God tells Abram, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought him these things, and he cut them in half, and he laid each over against the other. And that might seem like a really strange thing to do. I went over this with my girls a couple of weeks ago, and they were very shocked and felt very sad for the ram and the cows and the goats. But what Abram is doing here is he is preparing these animals for a very common ritual in the ancient Near East for this covenant-making process. So today, if you enter into a marriage covenant, there's a particular formal ceremony that takes place, right? If you see a woman in a white dress, if you see this exchanging of rings, if you hear this exchanging of vows, if you see this couple then kiss, you know that a wedding has happened. You know that they are then married. If you buy a home, we have a particular procedure for doing so. Even on the playground, we have a particular procedure for making an agreement. It's called a pinky swear. It's a very serious promise that you can make. Well, so it was back in the ancient Near East. What would happen is that you would take these animals, if two parties wanted to enter into an agreement with one another, if they wanted to make a covenant with one another, then what they would do is they would take these animals and they would cut them in half and they would lay them apart from one another. And then what would happen is the two would then state what it was that they were going to do, and they would walk between these two parts. And this was a covenant. It's interesting because the Hebrew word for covenant, for this ritual, it is actually in the Hebrew, the literal translation is to cut a covenant. And that is because there was often a very literal cutting that took place. And what you're doing, what these two parties are doing and signifying as they walk through these two pieces, is they're saying that if I fail to hold up my end of the bargain, if I do not do all that I have promised to do, then may I become like one of these carcasses here on the ground. May I then be torn in two. And so Abram here, he prepares the elements for this covenant-making ceremony. But then something very odd happens. In verse 12 it says, as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram. And behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. And then with Abram asleep, the most shocking thing happens. This covenant ceremony begins, and then verse 17 says, when the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these two pieces. So God himself, in the form of smoke and fire, very common ways in which God is represented in the Old Testament. If you remember in Exodus, when God is leading the people through the wilderness, he leads them as a pillar of cloud and as a pillar of fire. And here God is appearing in the same way, passing through these parts. But that's not the most shocking thing. The most shocking thing here is that God walked through the carcasses alone. Often, whenever there's a covenant, there are particular conditions for both sides. If you do this, I will do this, and if you do this, then I will do this, and then we walk through together. But here, the shocking part is that Abram's asleep during this whole thing. Abram cannot move. He can only watch what God is doing. God passes through the carcasses alone, and what that means is that Abram doesn't need to do a single thing for these promises. Abram doesn't need to lift a single finger. God is going to bless him, and Abram isn't required to do anything. There's no stipulation upon him. There's no condition upon him. This is an unconditional, gracious covenant that's being made to Abram. Because what God is saying is he's going to do it all. He is taking full responsibility. Here God is swearing to his own hurt that he will fulfill all that he has spoken. And he is promising quite a bit. He is promising really to do the impossible. He is this person who's going to the track, and he is placing his bets on the oldest horse. And he's saying, yeah, from you, old man, I'm going to make a nation. From you, old man, I am going to bring about all of my great promises. I'm going to bring from you a people, and I'm going to care for them like the sheep of my own pasture. And if there's any doubt that this is what was taking place, verse 18, it just makes it abundantly clear. It concludes by saying, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram. It's done. It's set in stone. It's irrevocable. It's the unbreakable vow that's made here. God is bound to keep his word, and he's bound to his own hurt. This is the person that you are dealing with, church. This is the person who has made his wonderful promises to you. This is the person, if you are a Christian, you are in a covenant with God, and this is the type of covenant that you are in. This is the agreement that you have with God. It's the type that doesn't require anything from you but only grace. God here, He doesn't leave anything in your hands. Like Abram, you and I are called to keep our eyes fixed on this God. We're called to fix our eyes on this God, the one who walks through alone and promises to you that He will hold up His end of the bargain, because this is how seriously our God takes His covenant. Here, God swears to His own hurt to fulfill this, and this is the same thing that we see in the New Testament. When we come to the New Covenant, Jesus Christ on the cross, He allowed Himself to be torn apart for you. But He did this not in order not because he failed in that covenant, but He did this because He had to fulfill that covenant. In order to fulfill the promise that He had made, Christ allowed Himself to die. And to make sure that you are a recipient of this promise that He is making to Abram. The lesson here is that your relationship with God is not based upon what you do, church. Your life may look really good right now. Your life may look kind of awful. But none of that is a sign to you about how God feels about you. None of those things are a sign to you about how well you're doing. If things are going well, that doesn't mean that you're being particularly obedient. And if things are not going well, that does not mean that you are being disobedient. That's not what those things mean. The only thing that you need to look at, the only thing that you need to know how God feels about you is by looking at the cross, keeping your eyes fixed on the cross, keeping your eyes fixed on the covenant which God has made when He ripped His Son apart for you. That's how God feels about you, church. And like Abram, you and I, we are called to receive that good news in only one way. We don't receive it by law keeping. We don't receive it by thinking, okay, well, I now need to hold up my end of the bargain. That's not how this arrangement works, but we receive it by faith. So listen to Romans 4, and we're going to end with this. Listen to how Paul interprets these events that are taking place here in Genesis 15. He says, "For the promise to Abram and to his offspring that he would be heir of the world did not come through the law." Meaning all those promises, they didn't come through obedience, but they came through the righteousness of faith. His faith was counted to him as righteousness. But the words it was counted to him were not written for his sake alone, but for ours also. It will be counted to us who believe in Him who raised from the dead Jesus our Lord, who was delivered up for our trespasses and raised for our justification. What Paul is saying here is that faith is what has made you righteous in God's sight. Faith is what has made you a recipient of all of God's wonderful promises. There is nothing for you to do but to believe those promises. And you and I here to grow in our faith, you and I here to grow in our belief, we're called to not look at what's not happening to us, but we're called to keep our eyes fixed on what has already happened for you. Look at the God on the cross. Look at Jesus Christ on the cross, because there you see all of God's wonderful promises. You see how seriously God takes His promises. And you see your own salvation and how God feels about you. Let's pray.